The ballroom at Ashvale House held 200 candles, and every one of them seemed to find Josephine Larsen at the same moment the Duke of Ashvale crossed the floor toward her. She had been standing near the east wall, as she always stood, in the space that ballrooms reserve for companions and poor relations, and women whose names the evening had already decided not to remember. Her gown was ivory, retrimmed in pale blue ribbon, and she had done what she could with the lace at the collar, but the women around her wore silk the color of garnets and sapphires, and the difference was visible from the gallery above. She held a small ivory fan, closed, one gloved thumb pressing the guard in a slow, steady rhythm that had nothing to do with calm. She was watching the center of the room because there was nowhere else to look, and the center of the room was watching the Duke. He stood at the far end, near the long windows that faced the gardens, and he was still in the way that powerful men are sometimes still when they have decided something and are only waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it. His jaw was set, his coat immaculate, his expression the particular neutrality that the room around him had learned to read as indifference. The women at his left, Lady Meredith Farr and the polished Miss Cecily Wyndham with her diamond eardrops and her perfectly arranged smile, seemed to believe themselves the objects of his attention. They were not. Josephine did not know that. She was looking somewhere else when he began to move. She heard the change in the room before she saw its cause. A small shift in sound, a collective held breath moving through the assembled guests, the way wind moves through a field, flattening the noise to something low and expectant. She turned her head. The Duke of Ashvale was walking toward her, directly, without deviation, across 40 feet of polished floor, and every pair of eyes in the ballroom was following him. Her thumb stopped pressing the fan guard. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for one full moment without speaking, as though confirming something he had already decided, and then he held out his hand. "Miss Larsen," he said. "Will you dance?" The room was perfectly silent. Josephine Larsen looked at the Duke of Ashvale's extended hand, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever she answered, the evening was already changed. What she did not yet know was that she was the only person in the room who did not understand why he had come to her, and that the question forming behind his eyes was not what anyone watching had assumed it to be. She had arrived at Ashvale House 11 days earlier in a hired carriage that listed slightly to the left and smelled of damp wool and some previous passengers' tobacco. Her distant cousin, Miss Agatha Poole, had met her at the door with a look of carefully managed guilt, and had explained, in the corridor before the housekeeper appeared, that Lady Meredith had been quite clear about where the companion would be seated at table. Below the two sisters from Harrogate. Above the upper housemaid, but only just. Josephine had listened without visible reaction, which was a skill she had been developing for some time. Her father, Mr. Arvid Larsen, had died in March, leaving £4,000 of accumulated debt and a household that the creditors' solicitors had reduced to 2 traveling trunks inside a week. She was 22 years old. She had a good education, serviceable French, and a naturally steady hand, all of which were precisely as useful to her current situation as a warm coat in a burning house. The Poole connection was her only remaining open door, and she had walked through it knowing the temperature on the other side. The Dowager had established the terms of Josephine's residence at Ashvale House within 48 hours. Lady Meredith Farr was 60 years of age and carried that age in the way that women of her station sometimes carry it, as a kind of accumulated authority, the weight of every correct thing she had ever done pressed into her bearing. She was not unkind in the manner of people who take pleasure in cruelty. She was unkind in the manner of people who have never been required to examine the effects of their particular variety of indifference. She wore jet beads still. In half mourning for the late Duke, and she deployed her fan with a precision that suggested she had considered each stroke as a social instrument. She looked at Josephine once, the first morning at breakfast, and then looked past her with an ease that communicated more clearly than any spoken word that the young woman at the foot of the table was not expected to require looking at again. "A companion," Lady Meredith said to Mrs. Poole, at a volume that carried precisely as far as Josephine's chair, "is a practical arrangement. One need not confuse practical arrangements with guests." Josephine spread marmalade on her toast with the same care she brought to every small action that was visible to others. She did not flinch. She had learned that the world rendered its verdicts most freely when it believed no one was keeping score. The first ball of the Ashevale spring season was a local affair. 40 families drawn from the surrounding county, the ballroom opened for the first time since the late Duke's passing. Miss Cecily Wyndham arrived with her mother in a carriage Josephine could hear from the upper landing, the horses' hooves on the gravel loud and confident in the dark. Cecily was 19, golden-haired, possessed of a laugh that was precisely calibrated to carry across a room without appearing to be designed to carry across a room. She came through the door already looking for Edmund Farre, the way a woman looks for something she has been told all her life will eventually be hers. Lady Meredith received her in the main hall with a warmth she had not extended to any other guest, and in that warmth, Josephine read the entire architecture of the season's plan. The dowager was not subtle. She did not need to be. Subtlety was for people who lacked the authority to simply arrange what they wanted. Josephine took her place near the east wall. She listened to the musician's tune. She opened her fan and closed it again, and she watched the room fill with people who knew what they were doing there. And she permitted herself one private observation, held entirely inside, which was that the machinery of the season, all its dances and whispers and carefully aimed glances, was really only a set of instruments for measuring how much money a woman did not have. Then the room held its breath, and the Duke began to walk toward her. She took his hand. She did not know why she did it. She had prepared 3 different answers to any number of hypothetical invitations she had rehearsed in the weeks after her father's creditors had finished with the house, and none of them had accounted for the specific weight of a gloved hand extended by a man who looked at her as though she had his undivided attention for the first time in a very long season. Her hand settled into his, and she let him lead her to the floor, and the room parted around them, and she heard somewhere behind her, very clearly, the voice of Mrs. Wyndham saying to no one in particular, "But who is she?" She did not look back. She danced. Edmund Farre did not speak for the first several measures, and Josephine did not fill the silence, because she had learned that silence offered by a man of his rank was rarely an invitation to talk. She watched his face at the intervals the steps permitted, and found it precisely as unreadable as it had been at the end of the room, and she thought, "This is a man who has been still for a very long time." And some part of her, the part that had spent 3 months in a cold hired room reading her father's debt schedules, recognized the specific quality of that stillness. She could not have named it then. She only knew it was not what the room thought it was. "You do not appear to be enjoying yourself," he said at last, not unkindly. "I am enjoying the music," Josephine said. "The rest requires some acclimatization." Something shifted in his face, very briefly, so brief she might have invented it. A movement in the region of his eyes that was not quite the thing people called amusement, but was adjacent to it. A kind of precise attention that replaced the neutral blankness. Then it was gone. "My mother placed you below Mrs. Hargreave and Miss Hargreave at table," he said. It was not a question. "The arrangement was entirely comfortable," Josephine said. He looked at her for one measured beat. I am certain it was not, he said, and said nothing else for the remaining figures of the dance. He returned her to the east wall afterward with a small, correct bow, and the room watched that too. And by morning the Whispers had already organized themselves into the story the season most preferred, which was that the Duke had run slightly mad, and that someone should attend to it before the summer. 3 days after the ball, a footman appeared at the door of Josephine's small room on the upper floor and delivered a note in Lady Meredith's hand. The note was brief and technically polite, and contained an invitation to take tea in the blue sitting room at 4 o'clock. Josephine read it twice, recognized the grammar of a command, and presented herself at the appointed hour. Lady Meredith was already seated in the room's best chair, which was the chair furthest from the window and closest to the fire, the position that left the visitor in whatever light the afternoon chose to provide. The tea was already poured. Cecily Wyndham was notably absent. Lady Meredith set down her cup with a small, precise sound and looked at Josephine for a moment, as though weighing something. "My son is not himself this season," she said. "The loss of his brother, and then the matter of the child. It has disturbed certain arrangements. I am sorry for his loss." Josephine said, "You are kind." The dowager's tone suggested kindness was not the quality she had summoned Josephine to discuss. She opened the small inlaid box on the side table and removed from it a folded bank draft. "I think it would be beneficial to everyone concerned if you were to visit your cousin in York for the remainder of the spring. A month's lodging and the expense of the journey. £100 in addition." Josephine looked at the bank draft on the table between them. £100 was 25 times what she had paid the hired carriage to bring her from London. It was a figure that her father's creditors would have accepted as a partial arrangement and thought themselves generous. She was aware of what it would do for her circumstances, and she was aware that Lady Meredith was aware of it too, and that the awareness was precisely the instrument being applied. "That is very generous," Josephine said. "I thought so," said the dowager, with the satisfaction of a woman who has rarely encountered a complication that money could not correctly root around. "I am afraid I must decline," Josephine said. The fire crackled in the grate. Lady Meredith's fan was closed in her lap, and her fingers tightened around it briefly, the only visible sign of the recalculation happening behind her composed expression. "You have very little to hold you here," the dowager said. "That is true," Josephine agreed. "But I made a commitment to Mrs. Poole, and I have not yet discharged it." She set down her teacup. "Thank you for the tea, Lady Meredith." She did not know, as she crossed the threshold back into the corridor, that the door to the adjacent dressing room had been standing open 2 inches, and that the figure standing motionless inside it, having arrived by the back corridor on his way to an appointment he had forgotten, was Edmund Farr. She did not know that he stood there for some time after her footsteps had receded down the passage, looking at the closed door with an expression his face had not worn in 2 years, or that what he was thinking, very quietly, was that he had been entirely wrong about her. What she did know, returning to her small room with the faint sound of Cecily Wyndham's laughter rising through the floor from the drawing-room below, was that she had now spent £100 she did not have, and that her tenure at Ashvale House had just been placed on a calendar the dowager was keeping. She opened the window slightly, for the air, and went back to her mending. The boy Thomas had a room at the east end of the nursery corridor, past the schoolroom where a succession of tutors had lasted, on average, 3 weeks before resigning. He was 9 years old, and he had not spoken in 7 months. Not since the letter had arrived from Spain confirming what the War Office had failed to communicate with any appropriate care, which was that his father, Captain Henry Farr, had died at the siege in September. Thomas had been present when the letter was read. He had not spoken since. The doctors had come and noted his excellent physical health and suggested country air and patience, which were the same two remedies they suggested for every condition they did not understand, and his uncle, the Duke, had provided both without visible result. Josephine had encountered Thomas on her third day at Ashval in the library, where he had been sitting in the window seat with a book upside down in his lap, looking at the garden with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is the safest available posture. She had sat down at the reading table without acknowledging him, and had opened the book she had carried down from her room, A Natural History of British Birds, and had read aloud from it in a quiet, conversational tone, as though she were simply reading to herself, and his presence was entirely incidental. He had not left. He had turned the book in his lap right side up. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She read natural history on Monday, poetry on Wednesday, and a chronicle of naval voyages on Friday because it had maps inside the cover, and she had noticed on the Wednesday that his eyes moved when she described coastlines. She did not ask him questions. She did not tell him to cheer up, or that his father would want him to be brave, or any of the other things adults said to grieving children in the apparent belief that the right instruction would open a door that grief had locked. She only read, in her steady voice, about birds and coastlines and the specific latitudes of the Southern Ocean. On a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after her arrival, she was reading about the albatross, its wingspan of 11 feet, its habit of riding wind currents for hours, without a single downward stroke of its wings, its life expectancy of 60 years or more. When Thomas said, in a voice like a hinge that had not been used in a long time, "Is that real?" Josephine kept her eyes on the page. "It is," she said. "Naturalists have recorded it carefully. An albatross was tagged near the Cape of Good Hope in 1789 and observed again in 1812, still flying." Thomas said nothing else. Josephine read for another 20 minutes and then put the book down at a natural stopping place and said she would be back on Friday, and went out into the corridor. Edmund was standing in the doorway of the small anteroom at the corridor's end, where the passage bent before the servants' stair. She did not see him. The corridor was dim, and he was very still. And she walked past without knowing he was there. And he watched her go, with his arms at his sides and his hands very still, and his face doing something it had not done in 2 years of careful arrangement, which was to be entirely without the arrangement. He had been there since the albatross. He had heard everything. If you have found this story worth your time, I would be grateful if you would leave a comment or press the like, so that stories like this one find the people who need them. Now, back to Ashval and to what Edmund Fair was carrying. Edmund's brother Henry had been 3 years younger than him, easier in all the ways Edmund was not. The kind of man who laughed at dinner and knew every stableman's name and wrote letters home from Spain that made the women in the household cry with a combination of pride and anticipatory grief that turned out to be entirely warranted. He had died on a Tuesday morning in September, 2 years prior to the season the story is recording, and Edmund had received the formal notification and attended to the necessary arrangements, and then had walked to the end of the long gallery at Ashval, and had stood there for a very long time, looking at the portrait of himself and Henry at the ages of 12 and 9, painted in the garden with the old oak visible behind them. He had promised Henry, the last time they had spoken before Henry's regiment departed, that Thomas would be all right. That was the precise formulation Henry had used. "Tell me he'll be all right, Edmund." And Edmund had said, "He will be all right," with the confidence of a man who had never yet failed to arrange what he had promised. He had then watched his nephew fall into a silence so complete, it felt less like grief and more like an absence, as though the boy who had been there before the letter arrived had been replaced by a very careful imitation, who breathed and ate and occasionally looked out windows. The doctors had come with their country air and their patience. They had said what they always said. Edmund had stood at the door of the nursery on 6 separate evenings and had been unable to go in, because every time he looked at Thomas, he saw the face that was Henry's face slightly rearranged, and something in his chest performed an action he had no language for. And he had concluded, in the only way available to a man of his particular formation, that his presence was doing the boy no good, and that a careful and considered distance was therefore the kinder arrangement. He had been wrong about that too. He understood this now. Standing at the end of the corridor where Josephine's footsteps had just receded, because he had watched an unremarkable young woman in a retrimmed gown sit quietly with his nephew for 2 weeks and read about birds and coastlines without requiring anything from him. And in 20 minutes, she had done what Edmund had spent 7 months attempting and failing to accomplish in various increasingly formal ways. She had given Thomas a reason to speak. The thing he could not reach in himself. The thing he had decided. After Henry and after 2 years of governing this house and this grief, that he was no longer built for. She had located it in his nephew, with a book about a bird that flew for decades without landing. He stood in the corridor for a long time. The drawing room at Ashvale House held 30 guests on the Thursday afternoon that Lady Meredith chose to make her position clear. It was an occasion assembled under the pretext of cards and tea, and Josephine attended it because Mrs. Poole had extended the invitation with the particular expression of a woman who wants to be somewhere else, but cannot afford to say so, and Josephine had not yet found a reason to refuse an invitation that would hold up to scrutiny. She sat near the window with her teacup and listened to the room proceed through its usual commerce of observation and inference. Cecily Wyndham was at the card table with her mother and 2 young men who had not yet received the information that Cecily was already spoken for in Lady Meredith's internal schedule. The dowager moved through the room with the ease of a woman at home in every room she had ever entered, pausing here and there, touching an arm, saying the correct words, and arriving, finally, at the small circle of county matrons nearest to where Josephine was seated. "Mrs. Hartley," Lady Meredith said to the woman directly beside Josephine, at a volume calibrated to carry to the window seat. And no further. "I understand you have met my son's companion arrangement for the season. Miss Larson. The Larson family, you understand, has had considerable difficulties. The father's estate, what there was of it, went to clear some £4,000 of accumulated obligations. There is nothing left. The girl is here on Agatha Poole's charity, not the family's standing." She paused. One hopes she understands the appropriate scope of a companion's ambitions. Mrs. Hartley murmured something sympathetic. The woman to her left was newer to the county, and said, clearly enough to be heard at the far end of the room, "A fortune hunter, do you mean?" "I mean," Lady Meredith said, with the precision of a woman who does not need to use the word when the sentence structure has already used it for her, "that the appropriate arrangements have been contemplated by those with the judgment to make them." Josephine set down her teacup with no more sound than it had made when she lifted it. She did not look at Lady Meredith. She looked at the garden through the window, at the early spring light on the gravel walk. And she kept her face exactly as it had been, because the alternative was to allow the room to see her humiliated, and that she would not do. She had known this was coming. The £100 had been the opening move, and the refusal had obliged Lady Meredith to escalate. And this, 30 witnesses and a word like fortune hunter deployed in the comfortable circumlocution of a woman who never said the thing directly. This was the escalation. Edmund was not in the room. He was in the North Library reviewing the estate accounts with his steward, which meant no one in the drawing room was obliged to moderate their expressions, and 30 faces composed themselves into the particular arrangement that English rooms settle into when a social judgment has been delivered and requires silent ratification. One or two women looked away from Josephine with the delicacy of people removing themselves from an unpleasant scene. The rest simply recalibrated, the way crowds do when a verdict arrives from an authority they have chosen to recognize. Mrs. Poole found Josephine's eye from across the room and held it briefly, and her expression said, as clearly as any spoken sentence, that she was sorry, and that she was powerless, and that she hoped Josephine understood that she was both of those things simultaneously. Josephine understood. She left the drawing room at the earliest acceptable interval and went upstairs. The housemaid who came to Josephine's room the following morning carried a note from Lady Meredith and a set of folded linen, the linen being a practical consideration, the note containing a sentence about the month of May and the desirability of settled arrangements and the Poole commitment having reached its natural conclusion. It was, as all of Lady Meredith's instruments were, technically polite. It said Josephine was to leave Ashvale House by Friday. It was Tuesday. Josephine sat on the edge of the bed with the note in her hands for the length of time it took to read it twice, and then to read it once more slowly. And then she folded it and put it in her pocket and sat for a little while looking at the window, at the sky above the park wall, which was the particular pale gray of an English morning that has not yet decided what it will become. She spent Wednesday in the ordinary way, attending to Mrs. Poole's correspondence and taking her turn reading to Thomas in the library, where she had reached the chapter on petrels and their navigational abilities. Thomas asked her, in his slow, careful voice, that was still learning to be a voice again, whether birds were afraid when they flew over water with no land in sight, and she said she thought they were not afraid because they were built for exactly that situation, and he considered this for a long moment and said that was good. She went back to her room that evening and sat at the small writing table by the window. She did not write to York. She did not write to the 3 other connections she had rehearsed in the cold hired room after her father's creditors had finished their work, all of whom had responded to her earlier inquiries with letters whose warmth was precisely inversely proportional to the specificity of their offers. She took a sheet of paper and trimmed the pen and sat for some time with the nib above the page, and then she wrote to Edmund Farr. She wrote it carefully. In the same steady hand she brought to everything visible. She said that she understood she had been invited to leave, and that she would leave on Friday as requested. She said she did not write to contest the arrangement because she understood the arrangements were not hers to contest. She said she wrote only because she thought someone should know about Thomas, specifically that he had begun to speak again in small, careful installments, and that the chapter on petrels would need to be finished by someone, and she hoped whoever that was would continue with the natural history and not switch too quickly to improving literature, because he needed a reason to find the world interesting before he could be asked to find it instructive. She said one other thing at the end. In 4 sentences she wrote without stopping and did not cross out. She said that she had danced with him once and had understood from that dance that he was a man carrying something he had decided to carry alone, and that she did not know what it was and did not presume to know. And she thought he was wrong, that carrying it alone was the correct method. And she said this knowing it was not her place to say it, and saying it anyway, because Friday was coming, and she would rather say it and be wrong about whether it was her place than leave without having said it and be right about nothing at all. She left the letter unsealed on the writing table and went to bed. Edmund found it Thursday morning. He had gone to her room because he had spent Wednesday evening reviewing the conversation he had conducted with his steward about the Eastfield drainage, and had found that his attention had migrated from the drainage to the door of the anteroom and then back along the corridor to certain 4 sentences he had overheard his mother deliver in a drawing room he had not been present in, and had finally concluded that he had been arranging things carefully from a distance for 2 years, and the arrangements had produced Thomas in a window seat with an upside-down book and himself in a long gallery, looking at a portrait, and that the theory of careful management from a distance required, perhaps, some revision. He knocked. No answer. He opened the door and found the room empty and tidy, the 2 traveling trunks standing closed at the foot of the bed, and the letter on the writing table. He read it once. He stood at the window for some time, looking at the same sky Josephine had looked at the morning before, the pale gray of an English morning that has not yet decided. Then he went to find Mr. Silas Roke, who had been the Farr family's solicitor for 23 years, and who was staying at the local inn and had been waiting, with the patience of a man who has learned that the Farr family eventually asks for what they need, to be needed. The spring ball at Ashvale House was the second of the season and considerably larger than the first. 60 families rather than 40, the London contingent arrived at last, the ballroom at its full complement of 200 candles and twice as many opinions. Lady Meredith had arranged it with exacting care and considerable satisfaction, because Cecily was in pale gold and her eardrops were diamonds, and the evening had been structured in every particular that a dowager of her experience could structure, to arrive at a specific point. Josephine was present because Mrs. Poole had not yet found the words to explain that she was leaving on Friday, and because Josephine had not yet found a reason to absent herself from the last evening she would have in a house that had, despite its considerable effort to the contrary, given her Thomas and the Albatross and 4 sentences she had written without stopping. She wore the ivory gown again, retrimmed now in the pale blue ribbon for the second and last time, and she took her place near the east wall and watched the room the way she had watched it before, which was to say carefully and without expectation. Lady Meredith moved through the guests with Cecily at her hand, and the arc of their progress was visible from the east wall as a circuit of consolidation, each conversation a nail hammered into a structure that was very nearly complete. Mrs. Wyndham and her husband stood near the window. The London guests arranged themselves in the way that London guests arrange themselves, which is to say, in a manner that communicates they are doing the county a courtesy by attending. And then something happened that Josephine had not arranged for, which was that Edmund Farr walked into the ballroom not from the upper entrance where the family customarily arrived, but from the door near the musicians' gallery, with Mr. Roke behind him, and he did not stop to receive the room's attention, but crossed it in 3 strides that were longer and more decided than any stride she had seen him take before, and the room parted, and the musicians slowed, and 60 families turned to see where the Duke of Ashvale was going. He was going to the east wall. He stopped in front of Josephine and did not extend his hand this time. "Miss Larson," he said, at a volume the room could hear, "I ask your forgiveness for what has been done in this house under my name. The instruction to leave was not given by my authority." The room was absolutely still. Lady Meredith, 20 feet away, had stopped moving. Her fan was open and unmoving in her hand, which was the only sign that the sentence had landed. Cecily's polished smile had gone slightly uncertain at its edges. The way a smile goes when the event it was arranged for has not, it turns out, been arranged. "I owe you a more particular accounting," Edmund said. "But the public version is this." He turned slightly to include the room in what he said next, and the room accepted the inclusion because he was the Duke of Ashvale, and the room was in his house, and the room had been doing what he was about to override. 3 weeks ago, this ballroom was prepared to determine Miss Larson's position in this county by the width of a ribbon and the size of her father's debts. It made its determination. I am revising it. Lady Meredith said into the silence, "Edmund, this is not the occasion," and her voice had a firmness that was the last available instrument, the one kept back when all the others had been deployed. "I believe it is precisely the occasion," Edmund said. and there was in his voice something that was not unkind and not cruel, and was absolutely without uncertainty. He looked at his mother for one measured moment. You offered her money to leave. She refused it. You will perhaps understand that this tells me something about her character that no document could tell me, and that the document is nevertheless worth presenting. He turned to Mr. Roke, who stepped forward from behind him with the composed efficiency of a solicitor who has waited 23 years for this particular meeting to occur. Roke drew from his coat a sealed document, the wax stamp carrying the Larson family crest, which no one in the room had any occasion to recognize except Josephine, who recognized it immediately and did not move. This is a codicil to the arrangement made between the Larson family of Gothenburg and the estate of Ashville, Roke said, in the flat, clear voice of a man reading from a document. Confirming the standing of Miss Josephine Larson as a gentlewoman of legitimate connection to the families of this county, in full settlement of the obligations incurred by her late father, and establishing that any representation of her as a fortune hunter or impostor is a misrepresentation of her situation and of this family's history with hers. He placed the document on the small side table near the east wall, which was the only furniture immediately available, and stepped back. The room processed this. It processed it the way rooms process information that requires them to recalibrate a verdict, which is to say slowly and with a number of small conversational pivots that, taken together, constituted a sea change in the air of the room. Mrs. Hartley said something to the woman beside her that Josephine could not hear, but the direction of both faces was sympathetic rather than dismissive, and that was new. Lady Meredith stood very straight. Her fan was still. Something was moving in her expression that Josephine, watching her with the attention of someone who has spent 3 weeks being watched and assessed, recognized as a recalculation taking place at speed. The specific expression of a person whose most reliable instrument has just been shown to be calibrated incorrectly. She looked at her son. And then she looked at Josephine. And then she looked away. Not with the ease of a woman who has dismissed something, but with the particular quality of someone who has recognized something and requires a moment to place it correctly. She said nothing else. Edmund turned back to Josephine. Your letter, he said quietly, for her alone, was the most honest thing delivered to this house in 2 years. I have not been wrong about many things. I have been wrong about several of the things you named. Josephine looked at him. She was aware of the room around them, all 60 families in the process of their recalibration, but she was more aware of the specific distance between his face and hers, which was closer than it had been during the dance, and of his hands, which were at his sides and perfectly still in the way his hands were still when he had decided something. Thomas will need someone to finish the petrels, she said. A pause, very brief. He will, Edmund said. And then, after another measure of the musician's careful silence, I would be grateful if you would stay. She could have said a number of things. She said, yes. What happened in the following weeks does not need to be narrated at length, because the shape of it was already present in the ballroom, available to anyone who had eyes for it, and most of the 60 families did. The solicitor's document was received into the county's understanding with the particular thoroughness of a piece of information that confirms what a room has already, in its quieter moments, suspected. Lady Meredith withdrew from active campaign into something more closely resembling observation, which was its own kind of adjustment, and which she undertook without drama, because she was a woman of genuine intelligence who had been working with incomplete information and knew, on reflection, that she had been. Cecily Wyndham left Ashvale with her mother at the end of the week, in the same confident carriage that had arrived so loudly on the first evening, and she went with her smile rearranged but her dignity intact, which was exactly the outcome the situation deserved, and no worse. Edmund and Josephine spoke every day of the remaining spring, sometimes in the library and sometimes in the garden, and once for a very long time on the bench near the old oak that appeared in the portrait of Edmund and Henry at 12 and 9, and the content of those conversations was private. What was not private was the direction of things, and the county understood the direction of things from the morning after the ball, and proceeded accordingly. Thomas came to find Josephine on a Wednesday in May in the library, where she was reading about petrels on her own. He sat down in the window seat, which was his customary position, and said without preamble, "Uncle Edmund says you might stay." "I might," Josephine said. "The albatross," Thomas said carefully. "You said it lived 60 years. Flying. More than 60, some of them." He thought about this. "Did it ever land anywhere it liked?" She looked at him. He was 9 years old, and he had his father's careful eyes, and he was asking her something that was not quite about albatrosses. "It did," she said. Eventually. He was quiet for a moment, and then he opened the natural history to the page about petrels and put it on the table between them. And she read. "The wedding was in July in the small stone church at the edge of the Ashvale Park, and it was attended by the county and a portion of London, and, importantly, by Thomas, who stood at the end of the family pew with a solemnity that he shed entirely at the wedding breakfast when the cook produced a sugar confection shaped approximately like a ship in full sail, at which point he laughed out loud in the way that children laugh when something is genuinely surprising and delightful. And the sound of it moved through the room and landed in Edmund's chest in the place where the thing he had no language for had been living for 2 years, and rearranged it. Lady Meredith was present. She sat in the front pew in her best silk and her jet beads, and when Edmund and Josephine turned at the altar, she looked at her son's face and at the face of the young woman beside him, and she pressed her lips together briefly, and then something in her expression settled into something that was not approval, exactly, but was the first cousin of it, the thing that comes when a person of genuine intelligence finally allows the evidence to revise the conclusion. The months that followed are best described in the images they left behind, because that is the truthful accounting of a life that has finally arrived somewhere worth describing in detail. The North Library at Ashvale became, by autumn, the most used room in the house. Edmund worked there in the mornings, and Thomas did his lessons there after 11, and Josephine read there in the afternoons, and on the evenings when the light lasted long enough, they were all three present at the same time in the particular companionable silence of people who have established that they prefer the same room. By December there was snow, the first real snow of the year, thick on the gravel walk, and on the park, and on the windowsill of the North Library's east window, and the candles were lit at 4 o'clock instead of 7, because the light went early, and the fire was kept burning from morning until the last household had gone to bed. Thomas sat in the window seat and watched the snow fall for a long time before he said, "It covers everything." And Josephine said, "Yes." And Edmund, who was reading at the table and who had been watching his nephew's profile in the candlelight, with the specific attention of a man who has decided to stop observing from a distance, said, "It does. And then in the spring, you can see what's underneath, and it's usually still there." Thomas considered this information, which was, like most of the information adults offered him, also about something else. "Good," he said. The unsealed letter rested on the library mantelpiece, placed there by Edmund on the evening he had brought it from the upper room, and no one had moved it, because some things placed in the right position have a way of staying where they are set, not as relics, but as evidence of a specific moment when a person said what they needed to say. and did not cross it out, and the saying of it changed the direction of everything that came after. The fire burned. The snow fell past the east window in the soft, unhurried manner of snow that is settling in for the season. Thomas was laughing at something Edmund had said, a real laugh, the kind that came easily now and arrived often, and the sound of it filled the library and rose into the old house's rafters and dispersed there into the wood and stone of a place that was, at last, also home. If Josephine's journey moved you, please leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you. Stories like this one find their way to the right listeners, and knowing which moments land helps more of them reach the people who need them most.